Shri Kamal Kishore, Member NDMA India, Professor Jim Hall, University of Oxford, Dr. K. Vijay Raghavan, Principal Scientific Advisor, Government of India, Ms. Alice Hill, Stanford University, Andrew Mascray from Risk Nexus Initiative, and Rowan Douglas, Insurance Development Forum. Dr. Raghavan will chair this session. Professor Anand Patwardhan, University of Maryland, could not join us in person for some personal emergency. He will join us with a recorded presentation. To initiate the proceedings, I request Shri Kamal Kishore, Member NDMA India, to give an introduction to the IWDRI and present an overview of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure.
So, in the interest of time, I will just quickly introduce the agenda, and then we just get on with the rest of the proceedings. So, you will see we have a fully packed 2 days. We start with this stage setting session, and after that, we will go back into 3 groups. The groups will be in 3 different rooms, to advance the discussion on 3 thematic areas that we tackled in the previous workshop, on risk assessments, on standards, and on the notion of recovery. After that, we basically spend the rest of the day looking more at the policy level issues. We will have, right after lunch, a session on policy and governance, where we'll divide into 3 different groups of different kinds of infrastructure contexts. Small island developing countries and landlocked countries on one side, emerging economies, countries where we have the context of replacement and refurbishment. We conclude the day with a session on finance for disaster risk reduction. This is a theme we discussed last year. We thought that this is important enough to do this discussion in plenary. Tomorrow, we will have a quick recap. Then we will put the multilateral agencies on the spot and look at what they are doing in this space. We have a featured event in 2 groups looking at the role of emerging technologies and innovation. And after that, we focus sectorially. The sectoral sessions were oversubscribed earlier. There were 2 groups, now there are 3 groups. In parallel, we will discuss ports, railways, freight corridors, and then airports, energy, telecom. And water is a relatively big theme. It cuts across many different contexts. And then we go for tea that day, and then after that we look at some forward-looking discussion in a panel discussion format. So that's a quick introduction. With that, I hand over to the chair of the session, Dr. Vijay Raghavan.
Thank you very much, Kamal. I really enjoyed the morning opening session today. And it is particularly fascinating to see how different agencies, different perspectives, government, states are coming together. I'll just make a quick point, and then we'll have Professor Jim Hill giving his keynote, followed by the panelists, and then we'll have time for discussions. And my own intervention, I'd rather make after the panels come in rather than before. I'd just like to state one quick point before we start, which is, over the last couple of 100 years, we've always viewed disasters as something which are caused by quote-unquote natural events over which we have no control. But what we have done in the Anthropocene is created a planet which humans actually wield the paintbrush on what happens. So humans are in control of the planet, or have the danger of losing control of the direction of the planet. Therefore, our interventions have 2 components. One, they are largely created as a consequence of human interventions, and therefore we need to see what we can do to mitigate. But also the paths to mitigation may be very different from the path we have seen in previous disasters, because now we're going from a linear situation of small changes causing problems, and we correcting those changes, to uncontrolled, exponential, unpredictable changes. And how do we deal with that is the phenomenally important question, which I'm sure the panelists will address, and it'll be very good to hear from them. So with that, I'll hand over to Kamal to introduce Jim Hill, who needs who needs no introduction, I'm told.
Professor Jim Hall is a professor at the Environment Change Institute at the University of Oxford. He has been a key figure in the space of disaster-resilient infrastructure. He is currently guiding and leading the substantive work on disaster-resilient infrastructure within the context of the Global Commission on Adaptation. He has done path-breaking work on looking at infrastructure through a systems lens, looking at infrastructure not as individual pieces of assets, but as networks, and analyzing its vulnerabilities and looking at ways to address those. So with that, Jim, the floor is yours.
We have the slides.
Your slides. Slides.
Ladies and gentlemen, more investment went into infrastructure last year than in any other year in human history. At 2.3 trillion, investment in infrastructure is at an all-time high. And yet the human needs for infrastructure, which were implied by the Sustainable Development Goals, are still very far from being met. The World Bank estimates that there needs to be a scaling up and a reorientation in infrastructure investment if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The choices that are going to be made over the next few years will lock in patterns of development for years to come. And the critical question is whether that development is going to lock in increasing exposure to natural disasters. These aren't occasional or rare events. As I got on the plane to travel to India, we were absorbing the news of disastrous flash flooding in Indonesia, and you'll see how damage to infrastructure which was not resilient impacted the repair and recovery effort there. And then when I landed in Delhi, yesterday there was news of catastrophic flooding in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and neighboring countries. Nor are these issues unique to developing countries. This is just one instance of the stock of aging infrastructure which exists in advanced economies. This is the Dungeness nuclear power station on the south coast of England, first operated in 1965, built on a shingle piece of coastline, not designed to cope with the effects of sea level rise, which will need to be adapted, retrofitted in order to cope with the threats of sea level rise in the future. So we see a number of different senses in which these commitments to infrastructure represent major challenges to us both now and in the future. The first and the most obvious is the effect that natural disasters have on infrastructure directly. This is the Bay Bridge in California, in which the Loma Prieta earthquake led to the collapse of the top deck, falling onto the lower deck, causing further damage to that bridge, which was incidentally then repaired extremely quickly. This bridge collapse in Whitehaven in Cumbria, not only did the bridge collapse, but as is so often the case, there was a series of interdependent failures across this bridge. Not only was the road transport, but telecommunications and electricity and water network cables meant that the damage to this bridge caused multiple interdependent and cascading failures for the neighboring town. But those direct disruptions are often just a small fraction of the overall impact of infrastructure failures. And the disruption may span far from the location of where the failure took place, and it may actually occur even in the absence of direct damage. This analysis shows the damage and then recovery caused by a substation in East Anglia, and the panels on the right show the simulations of the economic effects of that. So damage to and disruption to supply chains can propagate widely across the country. These supply chain effects of infrastructure perfectly timed. We recognize them worldwide, and the next slide shows the notorious effects of the 2011 flooding in Thailand. 25% of the world's hard disk production. I think a lot more people recognize that after the flood than they knew beforehand. Toyota's supply chains were disrupted. Toyota's quarterly profits were hit by 18.5%. 150,000 vehicles were not produced because of the disruption of those Thailand floods. And those wider economic, social, political effects of infrastructure failures can reverberate worldwide. The Fukushima nuclear disaster stimulated a political reaction in Germany, where almost immediately Germany shut down 8 of its 17 nuclear reactors and committed to decommission the rest of them by the end of 2022. So there are global interdependencies which can reverberate across our planet as a consequence of infrastructure failures. And the final extremely important dimension of infrastructure and natural disasters is the ways in which infrastructure development can enable and inadvertently promote the build-up of exposure of people and economic activity to natural disasters. That's a phenomenon which Gilbert White, the celebrated American geographer, recognized as far back as the 1940s when he wrote about the levee effect of the construction of levees, promoting urbanization, giving a sense of security, possibly a false sense of security, in areas which would previously have been regarded as being too hazardous. And we see this phenomenon occurring worldwide with development, in particular with the opening up of transport corridors and urbanization occurring along those corridors, often in unplanned ways, in locations which are vulnerable, exposed to flooding, landsliding, and other natural hazards. Meanwhile, we have a revolution underway in terms of our understanding of the nature of these risks and the ways in which we might address them. A revolution in the availability of data and the ways in which we can analyze the risk to infrastructure, which is enabling us to understand in a way that we had never previously been able to do at a very wide scale questions of how big is the risk, where is it locating, and how may it change in future because of the effects of socioeconomic change and climate change. Just a few instances of that. These are new results. The first global analysis of the exposure of transport infrastructure, road and rail, to a range of different natural hazards. And it shows us how exposure is distributed differently across different economies, with high-income countries now most exposed to cyclones and earthquakes and surface water flooding, low and middle-income countries more exposed to river and coastal flooding. And we can look at estimates of the scale of direct damages. This is expressed in terms of expected annual damages. So in order to make these calculations, we have to look at a whole range of possible return periods of damaging events. That's transport infrastructure. We can look at energy infrastructure. These are new results which show the exposure of energy infrastructure, how many gigawatts of energy plant are exposed to floods at different return periods, and how vulnerability might be reduced by increasing standards of protection to that energy infrastructure. And in water infrastructure, we're able to look at what are the risks of cooling water shortages to power plants, what are the risks to hydropower and to water supplies from droughts. We can fit that analysis within a framework which is illustrated here, which at the top layer includes spatial analysis of hazards. In the next layer looks at the location and interconnectivity of infrastructure assets. In the layer below that understands what are the processes which are taking place on that network, on those networks. How many people, how much goods and services are traveling, how much water is being moved, how much energy is moved around the place. And then in the lowest level, using that understanding to understand the economic impacts of infrastructure failure. That risk analysis then provides the benefit side of a cost-benefit calculation. Benefits, because the benefits of investment in infrastructure resilience are reductions in risk. And those costs and benefits need to be weighed up if we're to make proportionate investments in infrastructure adaptation and resilience. I will skip quickly through an example which my colleague Raghav Pant will present in more detail in one of the sessions, where in analysis with the World Bank and with UK aid funding, we looked at Tanzania, the flood hazard on the left hand, and on the right hand, how that hazard might increase in future with the outputs of climate models, the exposure of the multimodal transport network, so where is freight moving around Tanzania, and where is that exposed to natural hazards, and then using that to pinpoint points of particular vulnerability within the network, which should be the priorities for adaptation and resilience interventions. That work was taken a step further in analysis in Vietnam, where we've done cost-benefit analysis of the benefits of transport infrastructure investment, both at present and in future climate change scenarios in the 2030s in both RCP 4.5 and 8.5 emission scenarios, so lower and higher climate change. So we're able to come up with really prioritization of infrastructure interventions. That then poses the question, how do we respond? And we think of that in three different layers. The first, and possibly the most obvious, is around disaster proofing of infrastructure assets. This is the second phase of earthquake retrofitting of the Golden Gate Bridge. And there are many instances, large and small, both with respect to new infrastructure and existing infrastructure, whereby new standards are being applied. One smaller scale example is this initiative around resilience to flooding of electricity substations in the UK, which, based on the type of prioritization that I've just described, the electricity utilities are going step by step through their substations and improving the level of protection to flooding. And we're, again, able to do these types of prioritization calculations at an increasingly wide scale. So now looking at road infrastructure, primary, secondary, tertiary infrastructure. We can look at the benefit-cost ratio of interventions. And then in the lower panels, the benefit-cost ratio if one looks at the most exposed roads. So that gives some indication of how we should be investing in order to improve the resilience of road infrastructure. And green infrastructure, nature-based solutions provide many approaches to improving resilience, which also yield multiple co-benefits. Here in relation to surface water flooding, which yields co-benefits in relation to urban cooling, recreation, ecology, and the general livability of cities. And we can think of instances of this in relation to wider scale flood protection, in relation to water resources, in relation to slope stability. The second category of adaptation we need to consider is how can we adapt the ways in which we use infrastructure networks in order to make them more resilient. So how might we build multiple routes, redundancy within transport networks? How do we need to invest tactically in increasing the stocks in just-in-time supply chains to make them less vulnerable to disruption? How can we enable, in a staged way, repair and recovery and track those processes as was done during the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico? And how can we use financial instruments, insurance, in order to build resilience in network operations? How also can we adapt on the demand side? So think about reducing and managing demand for energy, for transport, for water, in ways that inherently increase the resilience and the adaptability of infrastructure systems. And the final level of this thinking about resilience takes us to the overall goals of what are we trying to achieve with infrastructure development, and how can we build resilience into our overall planning for sustainable infrastructure. Because we recognize that infrastructure is fundamental to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. In some analysis that we're just about to publish in Nature Sustainability, we demonstrate that infrastructure influences all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, including 121 of the SDG targets. But also, and crucially, what we learn from the SDGs is that they provide us with a template for how we can design, implement, manage infrastructure which is sustainable, and how the benefits of infrastructure can be distributed equitably across society. We've been working with the UN, with UN Ops, to develop a process for planning sustainable infrastructure, an evidence-based process for infrastructure development, which begins with developing a platform of data on the current state and the performance of infrastructure systems, reviewing the infrastructure services that are provided at the moment, and then establishing an SDG-based vision for what are the infrastructure needs in the future. What's the gap between what's there now and what the SDGs imply is going to be needed in the future? That then leads to a creative process of identifying options. and evaluating those options in a way which is presumably resilient to electricity failure. And then analyzing those, thinking about the sequences, the pathways of infrastructure development, and how adaptive pathways can be established, which means that we can adapt investments in the face of future uncertainties. One example of that was the application in the island of Curaçao, which began with establishing a platform of infrastructure data, not only physical infrastructure, but social assets, and also the geographical location of needs for infrastructure services, an in-depth analysis of the interdependencies between infrastructure sectors, and pinpointing points of vulnerability, again, not just of economic infrastructure, but of social infrastructure around the island, which provided a basis for evaluation of the locations and the benefits of investments in resilience, and evaluation of options. As I say, not just physical options, but nature-based solutions and measures to enable repair, recovery, and disaster management. And within that framework, real-time warning and improving measures for emergency response and evacuation and recovery were considered a long time, those longer infrastructure plans and investments. That process has led to the establishment of an infrastructure planning authority in Curaçao, and the methodologies that we've developed and the capacity that we've built has been handed over to the government there. There are, of course, obstacles to those processes, obstacles in terms of capacity, because these are very complex decision-making processes. We have incredible knowledge now, some of which I've touched on, which we're able and ready to share, but that involves capacity building within institutions. We've already heard reference to the importance of standards, design, regulation, and strengthening of institutions more broadly. And whilst there's a strong economic case for investment in resilience, the finance to achieve that is not always forthcoming. But I think we're now at a time where there are incredible opportunities to overcome some of those obstacles. One I'd like to refer to is the growing movement around financial risk reporting, which provides a means of incentivizing adaptation, action, and disaster risk management. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is making really significant headway in encouraging and in due course mandating investors to report the various climate-related risks to which they're exposed. I think in relation to physical climate risks, and these are the types of indicators that have been identified, more progress needs to be made, and as I've described, there are data sets and technologies available now to enable better pinpointing and reporting of climate-related risks. But I think this is an incredibly significant development. And there are very exciting technological developments. One of my colleagues in Oxford, Steve Rees, works on machine learning, pattern recognition from satellite data, which enables almost immediate recognition of disaster damage from earthquakes to inform recovery processes. And we've already heard reference to the global frameworks within which this action can be located. And between them, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework, the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda, provide a comprehensive framework at an international level within which these actions can be inhabited. And here at this workshop, we're working towards a coalition for disaster-resilient infrastructure, which will provide an extremely important international initiative to move towards concrete action. Meanwhile, the Global Commission on Adaptation, which is a co-sponsor of this event, is working towards its report to the Secretary-General's Climate Summit in September, and a year of action around adaptation following on from that. And so we have an opportunity to input to that process and make sure that the priorities from this meeting are fed into the Global Commission's deliberations. And where this, I think, will lead us to what I refer to here as a prize, but I'd also, I think, refer to it as a necessity of these huge infrastructure investments which we see over the coming years. 80 trillion, according to one estimate, by in the next 15 years. That's more than the total stock of infrastructure which exists on the planet at the moment, which is about 50 trillion. 80 trillion of infrastructure but which will meet the needs of people and the economy as set out in the SDGs, whilst also recognizing the crucial role of infrastructure, both grey and green, in preserving and restoring ecosystem services, the absolutely central role of infrastructure in emissions reduction, and our understanding from the IPCC's 1.5 degree report that we will have to transition not only to net zero infrastructure, but to an infrastructure for negative emissions, and of course, in the context of this workshop, an infrastructure which is resilient and adaptable to an uncertain future. I believe all of that is achievable, and I look forward to discussing how we're going to achieve it over the next 2 days. Thank you.